Hello everyone and welcome to Avantika Designeering series or ADS as we like to call it. Every week on Wednesday, we feature design and technology leaders who share their professional journey, their thoughts on their domain of work, and designeering where the world of design and engineering meet. Make sure you follow us on social media Instagram, LinkedIn, Facebook, and Twitter. And with that, let's continue with your show.
The key ingredients for designing any product are curiosity and critical thinking. And in fact, both of these are closely related. Being able to solve a problem requires some essential knowledge and background, which successively can be satisfied by learning through research. And someone who is analytically inclined often has the ability to create new products. To understand the importance of curiosity and critical thinking more deeply, in this episode, we interact with Udaya Kumar Padmanabhan, Director of Design at Designet. He is seasoned executive design leader with more than 2 decades of professional experience in designing for numerous business verticals across the globe. He holds his expertise in design leadership and management, strategy, research, service design, product management, front end engineering, user experience, customer experience, and the list goes on. And that's why, on our journey of discovering designeering, on our first episode this new year, we talked to him about crafting curiosity. Hello, UKP. Welcome to Avantika Designeering podcast series. Thank you so much for joining us on the show today.
Hey Rohit, thanks for having me. Also, great pleasure.
Super. So let's start with an icebreaker. On a podcast show, you shared the importance to unlearn, having the humility to learn, even if you have been successful in an area. My question is, how do you keep going at it since it's usually challenging to remove the experience curve from your mind?
Yeah, great question, great icebreaker actually. So I'll begin with a quote from none other than Lao Tzu. There's a very famous quote that wherein he's supposed to have said, "To attain knowledge, you add things every day, and to attain wisdom, you remove things every day." Right. So, yeah, unlearning is kind of a oxymoron in itself. There are too many things that people think unlearning is, should be, shouldn't be, and all of that. But I think I will distill it into two or three key pointers that has helped me in the all along through unlearn. Initially I didn't know that I was unlearning things and reabsorbing, reacquiring certain skills, but that it turns out that that's what typically unlearning is. So one of the core things in the challenge of unlearning is that we typically are humans. All of us are driven by something called a confirmatory bias. What we know and what we think we know is the lens from which we all look at things and perceive this whole universe or our existence, if you will. But yeah, what happens is when something contradicts to what we already know, it is a given that 11 out of 10 times we will dismiss it, right? So when something contradicts your current understanding, we always tend to dismiss it, and that's the first challenge of trying to unlearn things. uh, what it means is you should always be on that constant endeavor to seek additive knowledge. When I say additive knowledge, it's all in adjacency. What can a chef learn from probably a mechanical engineer? What can uh, a person who's trying to ride a two wheeler, a geared bike, what can he or she actually look towards how airline pilots actually do what they do. So there are tremendous amazing anecdotal examples around the world, but the first thing is to actually make a pact with yourself that what I know until now may not be necessarily what is through my tenure on this planet. That's number one. All the knowledge that we acquired so far, from data to information to knowledge, more or less is basically provisional. And I say it's provisional, what I mean is it's based on the context during which I learned something, and context through which I actually would have applied something, but that doesn't mean it holds water, like I said. And more often than not, most of the things that we know, no matter how many patents we have, what kind of knowledge we think we are, or what experts we become, we always work on the surface. Underneath the surface is a very complex and a strange world, and that is the realm of unlearning things. So the other thing, the point number two is, first is, like I said, we need to get away from confirmatory biases. The other one is to have a thirst for knowledge, a constant thirst for knowledge, not necessarily about your craft or your trade, but in general, you need to be curious, but also the propensity to actually question what you acquire. It's not GK, it's not facts, right? For example, our Independence Day is Independence Day. Nobody can come back and say it was not August and it happened in July, right? That contradicts the belief. Certain things can't change, but most of the things in the world can change. So that's the second point. Have a thirst for knowledge, but always question that knowledge. The third and the most important thing, which the industry lacks, the academia lacks, is this whole process of critical thinking. There is no course where there is no formal way where somebody has codified to transfer the skill. It is a transferable skill, but nobody has codified it wherein we can train people and also practice this whole notion of critical thinking. If you don't have these three things, I don't think you can unlearn anything at all, forget learning new things. So that has been my experience so far. I'll take a pause and see if you have any added questions on that.
Oh, that's an interesting perspective. And I think it covers a lot of interesting aspects in terms of the way you build perspective, the way you connect the dots, the way you actually develop skill sets to think the interconnected aspects around you in the world. And I believe that for a designer to have this kind of thought process and perspective is beautiful. So that was a really interesting icebreaker. And moving from our icebreaker to your journey, with nearly 2 decades of work experience in the industry, we would love to know about your inspiring professional journey. And can you share that with our listeners?
Right. Yeah, it's fast approaching the 2.5 decade mark. Actually, it has been very, yeah. It has been profound, and it has been fun, and it has been very interesting. And I wouldn't be doing or bartering what I'm doing right now for anything else. I mean, that's the kind of impact it has had on me. I'm a hardcore computer science, maths, and stats person by academic credits, but I've always been this creative person. I wouldn't say creative, but I had artistic, abilities. Maybe I got it from my forefathers. A lot of people in my family have actually, have reached, some amazing stations across the arts and all of that, if you will. So, and I had the most important thing, I think, was I had parents who never said no to my whims and fancies. They always supported me, and I always used to do all of this craft and art and all of that. And then, yeah, during my first year of grad, I started doing some, projects, freelance projects, and creating, visuals. I started off as a visual designer back in the day. Forget UX, UI itself was like kind of unknown territory in India. But I think I was in the right place, right times, and yeah, I think synchronicity worked. I started off, like I said, as a hardcore visual designer. My strengths were visual design at that point in time, and I used to do. This was the nascent stage of, the World Wide Web. Did a lot of interesting projects, fun projects. Got to know that it's not just skin, but there are bones, which is information architecture. So yeah, like I said, I had this immense curiosity, not this must have, should do, gain all the knowledge in the world kind of a mindset, but I always was very curious. Why is something supposed to be A and not B? So I think that curiosity is a super thing that I had, as second nature. And I picked up stuff, started working, started freelancing, right from presentation design to web interfaces to platforms to whatnot, multimedia. I mean, during the 90s and early 2000s, in the digital world, if you can name it, chances of me having worked on it are very likely. And then I moved ahead and was part of multiple startups, large scale enterprises. Was consulting for a lot of people. I have consulted for top agencies also, and I had a very profound learning experience and a rich experience both culturally and financially, and from an overall growth. And then yeah, then I suddenly thought that, okay, I've done enough. Let's come back home. And I came back and started working in the booming IT sector in India. and I think my career trajectory was amazing. I climbed the ladder pretty fast, and I happened all along my life I happened to be the youngest executive level person in the room, uh, until now. Now the things have changed. Now I'm not 25 anymore. So yeah, I I I I touched upon a lot of things, picked up product management. I have done multiple hats, including product manager, strategic designer, co-founders of multiple startups. I think it has been a rich tapestry of multiple roles, and that also was probably because of my propensity to unlearn, take up challenges, and look at failure and successes as two sides of the same coin. Either you figured out a way to work, or either you figured out 10 ways that don't work. Either ways, it was highly educative for me. So yeah, in the interim, yeah, I've been part of amazing exits, and yeah, kind of almost all of the companies that I've worked for have either been bought out or they went public. So maybe I was, that's why I keep saying, there's this element of being in the right place and right time. And I think somewhere back in 2007, 2008, this whole bug of, yeah, we've done so many things for so many companies, been part of successful stories, why not do something on our own? And then when I started, I started off with two distinct startups. One was a multi-factor authentication, which is like bread and butter in today's world. But back in 2005, 2006, at least in India, RBI just floated a mandate that all commercial transactions have to be multi-factor. So a very good friend of mine, ex-colleague, we worked together in two, three companies. We figured out multiple different ways in which multi-factor authentications can be imposed. So that was one of the startups. In parallel, there's another one that was very interesting, was about this whole space of biofuels. So I was a co-founder of that company also, and then we saw an amazing exit there. And my startup, kind of, we had given us a certain amount of time, and we built the entire platform. We had filed for a patent, and then unfortunately, we were not able to raise capital. Given that we knew most of the VCs, most of the private equity players, because the space was a highly regulated one. Banking is highly regulated, and nobody wanted to bet on a two-person startup. We were a legal entity. We had a platform. We had demos. We had everything, but we couldn't raise the money. And amazingly, we had three letters of intent and contracts to actually run pilots, one in India and two in the US. All we had to do was raise some capital, put people on on the plane, do it. But unfortunately, that didn't happen. But then, yeah, me and my friend decided that, okay, the IP will definitely show light at the end of its tunnel sooner or later, but let's move on. So back in 2011, I think we said, okay, now let's get back into the industry. He found something interesting and now he's thriving. I found something and I moved on. But then, interestingly, 2 years down the lane, an interesting thing happened, wherein some other company actually was filing for a provisional patent for a certain solution that they figured out. And then, a priori search, we popped up, and then they got connected with us through some known sources, and then and the rest is a happy ending. We basically gave them the IP. Typically, we sold out without even having a single customer in plate. So, and then, yeah, I got back into the industry. I was part of a couple of agencies, and then I moved back to Arvind Internet. Arvind, like is a 2 billion, 3 billion dollar behemoth in retail, more so in clothing and accessories. They wanted to build India's first omni-channel platform, and I joined them as their head of UI UX, and I had a very interesting stint. And then some health conditions hit me, and I had to take a break. So after that, I took a break, but I could only take a break for like 2 months. I couldn't. I got a little iffy, if you will. Couldn't sit at home and all of that. And that's when again was talking to a couple of ex-colleagues, friends, and then got to know about Designit. And then I wanted to join Designit simply for the fact that, like I said earlier, I have been part and parcel of multiple different companies, have consulted for amazing agencies, new people, but I was never an insider. I was never part of a design agency. And Designit, like is one of the top 10 service strategic design firms on the planet. Wipro acquired them in 2015, and yeah, I made the cut in 2017. 2017 is when I was talking to friends, and here I am for about 3.5 years now. So yeah, can't complain. This has been my trajectory from the day I started way back in 95, 96 till now.
Wow, this is amazing. I think apart from a podcast, we could definitely think of a web series around this interesting journey that you've had. One of my questions here, in fact, multiple of them from what you just said, but you haven't been a trained designer.
Mm.
How is it that you lead a design company now?
Yeah. So yeah. So let me throw in a slight correction there. I am not a trained designer from the lens of did I go to a professional design school and get a 4-year degree or did a master's? Absolutely yes. But I think I am a trained designer to the extent that whatever I know today has been self-trained. So yeah, like I keep saying, the thirst is what makes or breaks your propensity to acquire knowledge and apply them. And yeah, a lot many today I see a trend that a lot of them actually are great with what knowledge they have acquired, but where they fall through the cracks is applied areas. There is theory and then there is applied areas. I think what worked in hindsight, what worked for me was I forced myself to learn things, not to just know things, because I was in situations where I had to deliver stuff. Designing a platform, getting things that were part of acquisitions were very interesting from a monetary aspect, from a growth aspect. But yeah, if you don't deliver the goods, you don't exist. So I think I had the self-imposed strain, good stress, bad stress kind of a thing. I used to stress a lot in a good way to learn things, apply things, and quickly iterate and learn things. So I think that way I was trained. Yeah, the whole world was my oyster. I had access to people. I have had a great network of mentors, great network of co-designers, and yeah, I think, and the humility to learn. So yeah, to answer your question, I think my artistic bent of mind, or my parents helping me to chisel what I wanted to do, and then my this curiosity and the fact that and yeah, I was always competing with myself. I did not I never thought that I should be an award winning designer because a couple of my friends were great. Back in Valley, you know how it works, right? In the US, I mean, every other designer that I knew of was working on some amazing things for companies like Google and Microsoft and Adobe. But yeah, I didn't allow that to mask myself. But I was like, whatever I do has to be one of its kind. And so far, so good. So I think maybe in hindsight, design school would have made me a different kind of a designer, but I have no complaints. So I think craft, the propensity to know that you don't know what you don't know, but there are ways to figure out, and being humble, yeah, is the secret formula. I mean, it's not a secret, but yeah, it's the formula that a lot many designers don't apply.
Super, super. That's exciting. In fact, one more question that comes out of your LinkedIn bio, it tells us that you've been part of successful exits and failures too.
Yeah.
The question that I have is, how did you push yourself through worse times?
Yeah. So like I said, I think again, I think basically, I think it was my formative years of how my parents raised me and my brother. Basically, one of the key things drilled into us was it's okay to fail. It's okay to not reach failure. According to my dad, was like not that you got 0 out of 100. Failure was like you set yourself a goal. For some reason, you did not reach the goal, but that doesn't mean that you need to fret and give it up. Basically, his philosophy in life was the analogy of climbing a mountain. Yeah, you start at the base camp, you go to the top, but yeah, I mean, just because you got weak or you got the chills, you got a cramp, doesn't mean if you look back, you have made some progress. Think about how can you make little progress, small progress, inch towards that. So I think that left a permanent brain tattoo in my mind and in my siblings also, that we are like, it's okay that you didn't get what you wanted to get. What is it that you can learn? What is it that you can repeat from this, and what is it that you can not repeat or not even turn back? I think that builds resilience. But yeah, yeah, we're all flesh and bones, right? So it's not that I got disappointed, I wasn't disappointed, yeah, and all of that. But yeah, we took it in our stride, and we always knew that what we had at hand was going to make a change. And the reason I quote failure also is, yeah, maybe we dreamt of taking this, I wouldn't say a unicorn, but take this as the world's most amazing multi-factor authentication company. And then dark days were during years 4 and 5, when we could raise capital and all that. So that I would say that we failed from that aspect of not running it the way we wanted to run it. But yeah, happy ending. I think you need to have resilience and grit. It's okay to fail. It's, and we all know, right? Probably five or six startup ideas eventually turn out into companies that they are the remaining 95 actually are in the startup graveyards. It's okay. It's okay to fall, but it's not okay to fall and not try to get up. Is what has kept me all along. And I, like I said earlier, I look at failures and successes as two sides of the same coin. Sometimes you get heads, you win. Sometimes you get tails, you still win. And that's the perspective that you need to have.
Hey, did you know DesignIt recently teamed up with International Federation of Red Cross and Red Crescent Societies, also known as IFRC, to graphically record Climate Red, IFRC's first ever virtual climate summit. Over 10,000 people from 195 countries joined the 200 sessions at Climate Red. Participants spent 30 hours discussing global needs and sharing local initiatives around climate change. In fact, one of the questions that I'm curious about, didn't you ever feel like being an entrepreneur again and going back to the entrepreneur's hustler's journey?
Oh, I would be lying if I say no, but absolutely yes. I think it all depends on where you start. All my life has been, stealth mode startups, large scale enterprises which have acquired different companies, spinning out new divisions, scaling up a design team from zero to 400 people. I mean, everything has been entrepreneurial, intra-entrepreneurial kinds. And even in Design It, I don't think I'm just working as an employee to my parent company and all of that. You do have a lot of roles, you do have a lot of responsibility and all of that. So in my mind, I'm still an entrepreneur. It's just that I'm an entrepreneur for a larger entrepreneurship, and we do things and we help others. So yeah, like I said, it's a mindset. And there are plenty of the whole world is beset with a lot of problems that can be converted into opportunities. Entrepreneurship in my mind is more about a mindset, and then other things actually coalesce together to form. Maybe it'll spin out as a company. You want to start a company, or you have part of a company and you're helping people. So I think it's more of a state of mind. So in my mind, I'm an entrepreneur day in and day out.
Excellent. And now moving from your journey to Design It. In fact, if one was to read about Design It, it offers broad spectrum of services, including product development, transformation services, professional education, and more. Additionally, there's a layer of different economies and their unique cultures where you operate in. The question that I have is, how does one build capabilities to serve such varied areas?
Right. Interesting question. Yeah, I mean, yeah, design is just a term, right, that we use for want of a better thing. It's like a super ocean. And there are multiple things in design. There are so many different streams of design, so many applied areas in design. And I think in Design It, I think when they started 25 years back, I think this coming September we will celebrate our 25th anniversary. What started in a chocolate factory, and what it has come through is an amazing story in itself. I think the as a studio we augmented adjacencies, we brought in skills, we brought in people. So we have researchers, we have PhDs in anthropology and public policy on the one side, to somebody fresh off the college on the other side. And that's the power of different things coalescing together is what is one of our key strengths, right? Coming to economies, I think design is a universal leveler, if you will, because problems are problems and people are people. So there are layers of cultural manifestations that may make a solution work in a certain way in a certain geography as opposed to another one. But the goals and the ambitions of the end users or the citizens or the people who are going to consume those products or services, or a blend of both, actually are the same. So I think our team of 500 plus people across 17 cities in the globe actually bring in that mix and match, and we are well equipped to actually solve problems at scale. It's easier said than done, but yeah, we never shy away from solving problems at scale. And yeah, that diversity brings in a lot of secret sauces to the table. That's how we manage to operate. And last but not the least, to operate in different economies and cultures, you need to do research, and we are a very research oriented studio. I mean, the general notion is when you say research, a lot of people say you don't need to do research. If you want any inputs, I'm the research note taker. I'm the CEO. I've been running this company for 20 odd years. All that is great, but what I say, research is deep anthropological studies. We go where the humans are, we go where the context is, and that's one of the key things that we do day in and day out.
Interesting. And while you mentioned about secret sauces, we want to know one of them, and which is about the work culture and design it. In fact, in a healthy design culture, the design is applied not only to the product or service an organization produces, but also at the organization itself. So can you take us through what is the work culture and design it?
Yeah, interesting that we have 10 tenets of non-negotiables that as design it, as we are called, as because we are part of design it, we are called design its, right? So yeah, we are a very 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 open, flat design studio. We don't get into these nuances of typical. Things are changing on the ad world as well, but yeah, typically there was a hierarchy, right? Somebody spent 30 years and then up the ladder. Hippo, the highest paid officer's opinion counts. None of that works in design it. The freshest or the freshest person to the most seasoned veteran, everybody has a say. And I think that's what makes us a great studio also. We have, like I said, 17 cities, but it comprises of at least 30 40 different nationalities, be that for a cultural lab. And among the 10 tenets, we have a lot of interesting things that many companies also would be having, like respect for people, respect for craft, and all of that. But one of the things that always stuck to me, and I always like, and I have no qualms in even repeating, is one of the rules basically is a policy that we say no assholes policy. So what we mean by that, what the company means by that is, you can be the greatest and the latest and whatever, but you need to be humble. You need to basically have humility, and that's a policy that is a non-negotiable. We follow. It's okay to voice opinions. It's okay to have a debate. It's okay to get into a literal verbal fight for what you think is right or wrong, but end of the day you do what is right for the problem or solution at hand, and there is no ego or one-upmanship. I think that is one of the most profound things that we always strive to follow day in and day out. And we are not the only ones. I mean, there are many companies, more so in the creative world, which also have similar rules. But writing rules are just rules, right? I mean, it's like the crime, it's like the laws of a land. I mean, there are a lot of rules left, but you still have crime. The trick is to actually absorb it, understand why we are expected to follow something, question the status quo, but once you get the essence of what it is, thrive and strive to actually apply it, and it leaves, it brings in magic. So I think humility and everybody's voice matters is something that we really really apply as a non-negotiable.
Super. So, moving from your journey to design it, let's talk about your opinion on the world of design. And the first one there is design is what matters. I mean, it is something we always hear. How do we design for what matters at a product or feature level is what we really want to know.
Right. Yeah, interesting that you ask. I think all design by definition should be something that should be consumable. The outcomes of that design should be consumable for the greater good, at the personal level and the societal level. But yeah, I mean, different people have different perceptions about it. But end of the day, it's like a simple analogy. Because you are one of the, because you're a great app designer doesn't mean you keep designing apps, take your paycheck and move out. Is that what you want to do? Or do you actually want to take a paycheck, design apps, and actually see through completion, and look at how can you improvise that? I mean, it's a very subtle difference, but that's what it is. End of the day, how you do the latter is a function of what you design. Is it going to go in the mainstream, and are going people going to use it? And if they use it, is it going to make a small dent in their universe? Is it going to make a change in the way they lead their day? Is what is what separates an industrial strength production lens of looking at churning out output. So it's basically the output versus outcome kind of a debate that the world is grappling with, right? What we say when design what matters is actually what matters to human is what we say, right? We don't. So what we say is we look at design as a problem solving, a skill, methodology, and all of that. But yeah, we won't do anything. We don't do anything that we think we won't work. For example, as a policy, we don't work with we generally don't work on companies that produce tobacco products, right? So there are certain boundaries that we have. So yeah, so we basically look at, is it going to help a human, and how? What is going to change for that human? We look at it from that lens, and that's our definition of design. What matters to people, humans, because what matters to humans is what matters to business, is actually our fundamental reason for existence.
My next question is, the design thinking process can take weeks and even months to produce a prototype. On the other hand, processes like design sprints take just 5 days. Design thinking teaches the theory but fails at offering a cohesive, systematic approach to go about solving a problem. The question that I have is, do you think design thinking is not a great methodology for practically innovating a product?
Interesting question. I think the whole design community itself is, divided between yes and no, basis your question. But here is my take. I mean, these are my opinions only. Disclaimer: it's not anyone else's. And I think there's a huge confusion between sprints and design thinking. In my mind, sprint is highly chronological. You can run anything in sprints. You can run multiple design thinking workshops and sessions in sprints, like a 3 day sprint or a 5 day sprint or a 2 week sprint and all of that. And design thinking, I think it has been from the time, I think, late 60s, from Herbert Simon to R. Kelly in the early 80s, 90s. I think design thinking has been happening for the last 60 years. It's just that it's found its seat at the table and suddenly it became a buzzword. Now, starting from that being a checklist of a corporate strategy team to being, something that is a must-have by agencies, it has had its fame, and I think the fame itself is, eating its fame away. Another parallel in our world would be the TQM, wave that we all have seen. Some of us, at least, would know. Yeah, total quality management was the rage, right, in the 80s, in the 90s, and early part of the 20th century. But I think its own success, it's the reason for its failure was its own success, because too many people, too many experts came in, too many people had their own views and opinions of what it is. I think design thinking as a process, as a method, is highly contextual. Can you actually use that as a methodology to innovating a product? Absolutely yes. But can you do that in a 3 day workshop? I haven't heard of it. But yeah, maybe it's not impossible, but it's improbable. I think context is what drives the outcomes of a design thinking process. And there are multiple things. You can do workshops, you can do this, you can do that, and all of that. But I think design thinking has been portrayed as the thing for you to do to solve all your global problems, and that is an absolute misnomer. It is one of the many more amazing tools and methods that is available to us in the design realm today. What design thinking brings to the table is inclusion, diversity. Everybody's voice matters. And it also builds, yeah, it's easy to say empathy. So one of the most misused word after the word God, right? Everybody talks about we empathize. Ask anybody about how their company or how they as an individual go about empathizing. I can guarantee you will not get an answer. At best, you will get some theoretical gibberish about this is what empathy is. So design thinking as a process, as a construct, brings in disparate people into the room: the business guys, the design guys, the marketing guys, I mean, different things, all the people who matter, right? Design what matters. Again, I'm talking from that lens. You get into a room. Of course, today getting into a room is completely changed, but you basically get converged with everybody. You figure out different, varied, disparate points of view, and then you figure out what needs to be done, what doesn't need to be done. The design thinking design sprints that you're talking about helps once you know what you need to do. Design thinking helps you figure out what we need to do and how we can go about it. And then once you have a essence fair direction on that, that's when sprints come. But yeah, I think the industry is peppered with we did a 1 week sprint and changed $100 million product to $1 billion product in 6 months. Very rare outliers, but yeah, that's not, it's like the man with the hammer syndrome, right? Design thinking is not the hammer for every nail that seems to be a design problem. So one needs to use the rigor and the common sense to it's a tool. When do I use a tool? That's the metaphor.
Superb. I thoroughly enjoy listening to things that you've been saying, and it's brilliantly, I think, being conveyed. Moving from there to my next question, there's a misconception that inclusive design is a unifying user experience. Designing an inclusive and accessible interface doesn't mean creating a one size fits all product, because there's obviously no such product. The question that I have for you, UKP, is how can designers develop inclusive designs for different sets of people who will have an equally productive experience using it?
Yeah. So again, like the design thinking continuum. The world again is split into design thinking. Universal design and inclusive design. A lot many people think both are the same. Some people say both are different. I would tilt towards the latter. First and foremost, people need to understand the difference between inclusive and universal design. So I think so. I'll start with the simpler one. Universal design is more about creating a product or a solution or a service or a way of thinking, basically an outcome that is universally appealing, right? It's not about the process. For example, logging into a web application. There are only finite ways of doing it. You put a username, you put a password. Irrespective of the caste, creed, culture, we are basically the a gazillion segments, dimensions into which demographics and psychographics break out. There are only finite ways of logging into an application, right? And that so much so it becomes acquired behavior and an expectation. It is not the process. It is a way of achieving a certain goal. Whereas inclusive design, a lot many people mistake inclusive design also to be, something that's an outcome. No, inclusive design is a process that it has its roots in accessibility. For example, people talk about accessibility. Does accessibility mean designing my products or solutions so that a partially blind person, a colorblind person, a partially deaf person, or somebody with physical disabilities? Yes, they are also part of your go to market strategy, but it is constrained only to that cohort of people, right? My application is colorblind proof is just a feature, but it still does not give coverage to people who can be disabled not from a physical standpoint but contextually. Simple example, you are riding the metro and it is super packed like a can of sardines, and you for some reason you have to get into a, and more so this example is apt in today's day and age, you have to be part of a Zoom or a Microsoft Teams or a virtual meeting. You don't need to speak up, but you have to be part of a meeting, and you are in the super packed crammed metro, going back home or going to work and all of that. That's the context. I'm just setting a scenario. Because of the voice levels, because of the noise levels, for all whatever is being discussed or whatever is being spoken may not be audible to you. That again is an accessibility issue from the context of my current environs, not necessarily because I had I have a congenital or uh, I have a temporary hearing problem. So people mistake, when I say people, I'm talking for designers. There's this huge mistake about using these as accessible design and universal design and inclusive design as synonyms, and they are not. Like I said, the key difference is universal design talks about the outcome, but inclusive design again is a method. It's a way of approaching problem statements, and it's a process. So the three key tenets that I can recall, if I, for inclusive design is, first and foremost, you need to recognize that there will be exclusion. Not everything that gets built gets used across the 7.5 billion people on the planet. You have ride sharing as a construct in today's world. Do you have a Uber kind of an experience in continental Africa? Maybe yes, but is it universal? No. This is where you could probably think about inclusive design. The second key thing for inclusive design is basically you can solve for one specific problem statement and a cohort of user, but you should always keep at the back of your mind that this needs to have extensibility, right? Now that the problem is being solved in a certain way, there will be different cultural manifests and different geographical constraints. Can we actually take the same solution stack and offer it to them in a different way, so that the source and the destination, the goals and objectives of the end user, is agnostic to the way the initial design was conceptualized? For that, basically you will have to bring in this whole notion of diversity, not just in in companies, but as designers, we need to bring diversity in the way we actually go about solving the problems. So to recap, you have to make peace with the fact that you will have to recognize that there will be exclusions, and you in inclusive design you actually focus on the pockets of exclusion, and you need to extend the solution to everyone. The outcome of your inclusive design can eventually morph into a universal design. So this is a very subtle but a very profound delta that more often than not people people actually forget or don't tend to realize, and then go about calling an apple as an orange.
Hey, did you know DesignIt has partnered with Tech for Good, an international impact innovation catalyst focusing on social and environmental changes? Together, they will define impact strategies, value propositions, and organizational design for companies looking to make a positive environmental and societal impact. Through a blended technology and a design led approach, they help organizations develop and implement strategies with an eye on the triple bottom line. My next question is connected to the world of DesignIt and Wipro. In fact, DesignIt has an umbilical cord connected with Wipro.
Mhm.
However, the cultures, working style, and approaches are entirely different from what we've heard in the last few minutes. But
Mhm.
it brings along a deeper understanding and access to robust technology solutions too. How does leading a design studio, which is a part of a large technology giant company, help?
Yeah, great question. I think Wipro. Yeah, we keep talking about the fact that Wipro actually is a mini country in itself, right? We have 180,000 people. We are spread across the globe, with more than 50 different, and we have humongous different people, numbers of people with different nationalities, and we have presence in more than 50 plus countries and all that. And given the behemoth that we are in the technology world, if there is anything that can be built, chances of Wipro having already built it or having the capability to build it actually is a given. Now, how does it help for design is considered as poles apart from technology, but I have been a strong proponent of design is just design if it doesn't get engineered. I always talk about the fact that great design needs greater engineering, because that is what brings a product or a solution or a service into life. So yeah, I mean, a large technology company then going and buying out one of the top design agencies, yeah, they just didn't go window shopping, right? It was a thought through decision. They spent top dollars to acquire DesignIt, because Wipro fundamentally feels that everything is actually a design problem. Now, whether that is UI UX design is not the thing. Everything should be looked upon as a design problem that we are, trying to solve. Not that technology doesn't have design. Technology also has design. People, architects design. The architecture. There are so many things, but a design-led strategy helps you to look at it from the goals and objectives of what the problem solution service is going to help fulfill, and it completely recasts the way you look at going about building systems. So culturally, I think Wipro has very strong tenets of do's and don'ts, and that applies to all of us. And in fact, it intersects with general principles of humility, customer first, uh, do what or do all it takes to actually deliver the goods, keep up on your promises, and all of that. Every large company has it. I think in terms of different working styles, now that we are 5 years through the acquisition, I think the larger organization also understands why design. What is it that these designers do? What is this beast called design? I think there's a lot of investment in terms of time and energy being spent by the larger organization. Today in Wipro, if you ask anybody about design it or design thinking or what they do, the chances of them saying I'm unaware is zero or near zero. So people understand that yeah, everything that we do it from a design lens. But initially, yes, there were frictions, if you will, like technology looking at things from just a feature functionality perspective, and we looking at from a human perspective and questioning the whys. Designers are very very notorious for asking questions, right? And it may not go well. So we also recasted it, and we also have realized that it's not about what you ask, but it's also about why you ask and how you ask. So I think it has been a fun ride. Now we are deeply embedded within the larger enterprise. People know us, we know people, we build relationships, and they also they also ensure that more often than not, every single deal that they are chasing, every single solution that they are planning to come up with, they ensure that they reach out to us, and it has been a very interesting ride. So I think it is more of two different mindsets coming together. Basically, the power of two is greater than the power of one, kind of an analogy. So it's fun, and what it helps us understand also is to figure out the limitations, the viability, the feasibility of tech solutions, right? It is easier for us to sit and think about how is payment, how is this whole notion of payments going to look like in the next 5 years. We can build a cool sexy prototype, create all of that stuff, but if the current day technology or the current infrastructure doesn't allow you to do it, then yeah, it'll fall flat. So that's why it helps us understand and appreciate what it takes to actually bring our pretty concepts and pretty solutions to life. So it makes us also have a sense of awe, if you will, about it's yeah, a button for me may take like 4 lines of code for a developer, right? On a numbers game, they put more efforts than us. So yeah, it helps us to realize that it's a partnership and it's not a competition. So we have been reasonably, I would say reasonably, we've been highly successful, and the kind of solutions at scale. I mean, we are we are running we are running deals that are like half a billion, a billion, and all of that. And this is huge, right? So no company will sign up with us if we do not bring in that services offering on a platter. And I think we have been pretty successful, and we are still at it.
Well said. I think the point of not competing and being partners is a very interesting perspective to the entire fact of how, to different school of thoughts. One which you said is very technology oriented, one which you said is very human oriented, come together and can actually create newer opportunities and newer business opportunities out there. Beautifully said. And while we've been talking about technology, in fact, its usage has become indispensable. But at the same time, there's a school of thought that expects technologies to become far more humane. The question that I have for you, UKP, is how can one do that using designing? Can you share an example from your experience where you've seen designing actually helping turn technology more humane?
Right. Yeah. I mean, there are like a few hundred examples that I can recall, but yeah, in the interest of time and for context, I'll give you an example. So a couple of years ago, Max Healthcare, I'm sure most of you are aware of Max Healthcare, right? In India, reached out to us and said, "Hey, we have large, augmentation and expansion plans, and here is a way in which we operate today. Can you guys come back to us and help us figure out, how can we do things that will increase the span of our coverage?" So we said yes. We took up the challenge. We said yes. We put the entire studio on it. We had a very intense, research session. Long story short, we actually helped them disintermediate healthcare as a service. Basically, in the traditional world, you have something, you fall sick, you have something, you visit the hospital. What we did was we told them, why not take the hospital or certain services of your hospital actually back home? And today, a lot of companies are doing it. Not that we were the first ones ever to do it, but yeah, from the context of Max Healthcare, we actually helped them take a lot of services back home. And in that, it so happened that it was not just the human, from a patient centricity aspect, or from the patient's caretaker aspects, but we figured out that one of the things that you could actually take back home is services like can I give a blood test at home, which actually happens today, right? You book a blood test and people come. But at the heart of it, like I said, the surface level looks all amazing, but underneath there are a lot of moving parts. So in the traditional world, it so happens that these guys are called phlebotomists. They are trained to actually draw blood, take your vitals and all of that. You book an appointment at typical phlebotomist comes to your doorstep at the designated time, and he or she draws your blood samples, puts it in the vials, and puts it back in their ice pack, or are they off they go. But a traditional phlebotomist's life is not just they do house calls on a one-to-one basis. Typically, there's a roster. They are given a trip sheet, and they pretty much cover probably 5 or 6 or sometimes more households, scattered across different parts of the city or a certain location. It so happens that once human blood is drawn, it has an expiry time of about 3 hours or 2 hours. very short span of time. It has to reach the lab before that. Now look at a situation where this phlebotomist has been given 6 strips, which takes him across the nooks and corners, disparate corners of a certain area within a certain city. Now once he draws first blood, literally, he or she has this conundrum of, should I go back to the lab, drop this blood sample, and then go back and meet this customer? Maybe it is theoretically doable, but there are unknowns, uncontrollables. Maybe there's a traffic jam, maybe the road is blocked, so the next appointment goes down flat. Assuming this person goes and drops the blood sample to the nearest lab, and then goes on his or her way towards customer number 2, maybe he or she is not able to arrive there at time, and that has a larger ramification from a customer experience, patient experience standpoint. So during this course of exercise, actually we figured out that it is unfair or unreasonable to expect the phlebotomist to collect blood, draw blood, and actually have literally have bloods on their hand and not actually give it back to the designated labs. So we introduced this whole notion of a runner, right? And now in hindsight, it may look like, oh, it's not a big deal, but yeah, it is a big deal, because what we proposed was, the phlebotomist actually draws blood, takes the sample, and basically inputs the fact that the blood is blood sample is ready, and at and defined pre-triangulated areas, here is the runner. The runner's job is to basically go pick the blood sample and go off on his or her way to actually drop the blood sample back to the nearest lab within the shortest span of time. This frees up this whole tension for the phlebotomist about worrying about dropping the sample in person and going back. So in hindsight, if you look at it, it is human from an employee experience standpoint. Two amazing things. It brought in this entire role called a runner, and there are multiple runners probably in a group like Max Healthcare, right? It generated a lot of interesting things. It generated a new class of work, and it generated employment opportunities for these runners, right? All they need is a bike, and all they need is an app, and they basically act as people who complete the journey. It also was more humane from an employee experience standpoint, where the phlebotomist now is focused on what he or she is supposed to do on time every single time. That is, do house calls, go meet the patient, do whatever tests they have to do, draw blood, do all of this, and hand it off to this guy. So this is a very profound, very simple, but very profound, and more often than not, uh, you know, forgotten kind of service interventions that companies should be doing. Employing, great employee experiences mean greater customer satisfaction, and these two metrics, if you add, your business will thrive, and then you generate employment. There are a lot of other things that pop up, but yeah, the essence of it is step out, think, look at it from a larger thing, and see how can you do this better. So this is an example where we use technology to actually disintermediate friction points for a class of end users. Also ensure that customer experience gets augmented, goes high up, and also helps the hospital to keep up their SLAs every single time.
Super. This is really interesting, and how I wish that our conversation goes on for some more duration. But in the interest of time, I wish to come to our last question. And in one of your blogs, you've written, if user experience is the face and gateway to a digital asset, then great code is the bloodline that keeps it alive, thriving, and accepted. At Avantika, we have a similar type of approach called as designeering, which is the blended approach of of design and engineering. The question that I have is, why is it important for designers to educate themselves with basic tech knowledge and vice versa?
Yes, interesting question. I think I had touched upon it earlier also, because I fundamentally believe the face and gateway will come to life, will actually solve problems, will actually make an impact to a business's top line or bottom line, only when it is there, alive, thriving, and it's being consumed by people. Now, the only way a digital product or a solution or a service can come to life is by great engineering. Why it is very important for designers to understand the nuances of technology. They don't need to code. It's good if they not if they learn to code basics. And in today's day and age, a lot of people have actually gone ahead and figured out that they enjoy coding, not and some have actually moved from designers to from a design world to a technology world, and some technologies have actually come back and become designers. Interesting things happen in a domain. But if you do not understand the building blocks of or the process in which your blueprint will get actually built, I think it is just a concept, right? You can sit and fire your tools and have your workshops and have your critique meetings, review meetings. You can put a fancy interface. You can solve the world's hunger problem, or you can solve the world water problem. It will only remain as a concept, to you know see light at the end of the tunnel. So traditionally, designers have operated in their own world, and technologies have operated in their own world, and both the parties were only as good as the constraints, or the freedom that they had to have at hand to actually conceptualize things. A lot many times, what you as a designer will envision should happen, looks like doable, but the technology stack in use, or the technology world in itself, uh, you know maybe is not mature, or maybe is not ripe for that to see to life. Simple example is AR and VR. I mean, 10 years back, you think AR and VR did not exist? It existed. Google came with the glass concept, many years ago. Adoption was an issue. It was, since it was an emerging technology, there were a lot of loose ends that they were trying to sort out for. So net, I think it makes sense for designers to understand that it takes a lot of grit and elbow grease to actually bring their designs into life by technology people. And developers also need to understand that designers are not this cocky, you guys don't understand, we are the creative types. In fact, coding is as creative as being an artist or a designer, if not more. I think once that piece is made, magic happens. You cannot just design in silo and expect somebody else to actually bring it to life. It doesn't happen. At the same time, technologists cannot think of the fact that, yeah, here is a epic, here is a user story, here is a problem that I need to solve, and feature. Yes, it is like, okay button is on the extreme left and cancel button is like 6 feet away, yeah, hypothetically. And say code complete, I have done the feature, now it is left up to the designer. It doesn't work that way. Both of them have to understand that there are two sides of the coin, and if one side does not want to see the other side, meld with the other side, if you will, then yeah, I mean, we will only be creating fiction, and not facts. So super important for designers, upcoming designers, to understand that whatever they do in the digital realms, at least whatever they do, their partner in crime to see that through life is the technologies. Super important.
This has been an amazing conversation, UKP. I thoroughly enjoyed it, and I'm sure that our listeners are going to have a lot of learning and take home from this. Thank you so much for doing this. Thank you so much for joining us on our show.
Sure, it's been a pleasure. I hope your audiences will like, and yeah, fun doing it.
Thank you.
Hey there, we hope you enjoyed our show. Do write to us on ads@avantika.edu.in. We look forward to your opinions, feedbacks, and suggestions of speakers you would like us to host on this show. Do tune in our channel next week on Wednesday for a new story on Hubhopper or wherever you get your podcast from. Follow us on Facebook, Instagram, LinkedIn, and Twitter.